really interested to know more about what health data means in 2020 and what impact that has had on your work. So I'll start with Lee. So what is health data in 2020 for you, and what impact has that had on your work?
Thank you, Millie. It's actually very exciting where we are in 2020 because technologically now we can crunch a large amount of data, and finally those data sets are being collected and start to become available. And the impact that had, especially in my area of ophthalmology research and also drug discovery, is that we started to get a good traction on trying to link those some very tenuous or light connection that exists between different signals or data sets, and try to bring some of those tendencies and signals more to the forefront, so we can start to understand a little bit more the nuances between different interactions on the different pieces of the structure, the network that actually causes disease or actually is behind the way that certain medicines work, right? So for us, that is really, really exciting. For me, the impact now today, we probably will come back later on, is that even though we talk about healthcare or health data, majority of this is disease data and less so on the health stage, right? So I just want to throw this already here. And then once we get back, we can start discussing with the other colleagues.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know more about that distinction between health data and disease data. But yes, maybe we can return to it. So Tina, I'd be interested in your perspective. So what do you see as health data in 2020, and what impact has that had on your work?
I think it's very, very interesting. I mean, I operate from a patient perspective. I have long-term conditions, and the aim of my work is to improve the involvement of people also like myself who have health conditions and service use in the work of the National Institute for Health Research. So I think we're open to all possibilities in how we can interact and reach people and have more of a dialogue around what matters to them, and also what matters to them and what is the impact that might be upon this sort of research agenda. So, you know, all this stuff can happen a lot quicker, hopefully a lot slicker. And I think the potential is huge, as long as we listen to people with health conditions who use services to make sure we focus in on what matters to them.
I think it's brilliant that you see the opportunities outweighing the risks. And that's maybe something we can also return to later. Thank you. So Indra, I'd like to turn to you. So what do you see as health data in 2020, and what impact does that have on your work?
It's a really interesting question, and just sort of picking up on Lee's point of, we quite often talk about disease data, but when you talk about health data, or rather health and care data, there's a huge scope here. So it's not just about that kind of clinical impact, but also the non-clinical pathways. So you talk about operational care pathways or the back-end processes. And actually, during the COVID times, I mean, we still are in COVID times, but during the last few months, we've seen a huge increase of, actually, when you put some of that operational data, it really helps you improve a care system, both health and care system. And so I think moving forwards, we're going to have to open our eyes to, it's not just clinical when we talk about health. There's a huge spectrum here.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And Tarek, I'd like to bring you on this point too. So what do you think health data is in 2020?
Thanks, sure. And maybe just adding on the last couple of responses, to paraphrase Sir Michael Marmot, who sort of said every minister is a health minister. You could argue that now all data are health data as well. In Wellcome's new strategy, which we launched this week, we have a focus on three big topics: infection, mental health, the impact of global heating or climate on health, and discovery research. And even if you look under the hood of those 4 areas, you see a whole bunch of different flavors of data, if you like. So for instance, in infection, you might be looking at antibiotic prescribing data in countries like Kenya, where you're trying to build policies to combat antimicrobial resistance. For mental health, you might be doing things like understanding the impact of exercise and movement on mental well-being. And to do that, you need data from fitness trackers and sort of other health monitoring systems. And for climate, I mean, understanding the impact of global heating, so literally climate data, how heating directly affects human lives, but also affects the ecosystem. So whether more heat in one area causes species to move to another, which in turn causes diseases to move in a different way. So all that is to say that the world of health data is pretty enormous. And I think one question from a policy point of view is our definition of health data is almost always too narrow or too broad. And unless we figure out where to kind of draw some lines there, we won't quite know how to govern it, and we won't quite know what sort of risk profile to attach to different flavors of data. Thanks.
So what are the risks of either defining it too narrowly or the risks of defining it too broadly?
Sure. So, I mean, just playing out some scenarios. If you defined health data too broadly, let's say, financial transaction data. If you look in my credit card statement, you might see that I go twice a week down the road to get an ice cream. Now, should that data be considered health data because you can make some inference about my health or sort of life choices? I'd argue probably not. That feels either creepy or maybe minimally useful to me managing my health. At the same time, if we restrict the definition of health data and the sort of governance we put around it just to kind of clinical things or things that you interact with the health system around, you're bound to be missing valuable signal there that either you could be taking advantage of or other organizations could be gaining insight from. So that's not really an answer to your question, but maybe adds a bit of color to what I mean about some of the choices that are there.
I think that's really interesting and useful because it draws out what Lee was saying about, it's not just health data, it's also disease data. And what Indra was saying, well, it's also operational data, all of these things, and what Tina was saying, that you've also got to kind of, make sure that you've got that patient and public involvement before you start the research on it in order to untap the potential of this. So it's really useful to understand the kind of the spectrum of opportunities and the considerations that need to be in place about how best to use this. That's brilliant, thank you. So Lee, I mean, you've been involved in more than one health initiative or health research initiative, and what have you seen as the kind of, I guess the consequences or the potential from unlocking that data access, in more than one domain or across different projects?
Right. So, thank you, Minnie. I'd like perhaps to just start with the concept, coming down to what Indra, Tina, and Tarek have said about to narrow to broad before we go into exactly what we are doing. And I think that's a great example of sometimes we are, as a scientist, and I'm a scientist by background, clinician as well, we do have a problem of selective attention. We are always looking at things we were trained to look at. However, many of the opportunities, the data we're missing, come from very orthogonal spaces, right? So things we never expected to find. So one of the things we started working on, and I looked into the AMD, which is age-related macular degeneration. Everything that is done now for the AMD tackles the late stage of the disease, because that is one thing that is really obvious. People go to hospital, they have high quality scanners, they can get those data points in. And the entirety of, if you like, AI training is based on that very late stage hospital set.
Yeah.
Now, when you try to bring this to population community, try to say, let's find what causes the disease. What can we do to start interfering before it really causes a real problem? We don't have that data set yet. Now, one very interesting and great work from one of our collaborators, Piers Keane, back in, I think, 2016, he started working with a small company called DeepMind. Yes, back then, because they had these eye scans. And they said, what can we do to use those eye scans to look for features that it is just new technology, no one has trained that long enough to start picking all those subtle signals. Very quickly, they come up with an algorithm that can do the perform diagnosis of more than 30 different ophthalmology conditions at the same level as the most experienced consultants at the Moorfield Eye Hospital. That is fantastic, because even though we love our clinicians, they can only work 24 hours a day, perhaps, no more than
Perhaps,
that.
yeah. Maximum, yeah.
Yes. But imagine if we had something that can be distributed, that can help augment the capability, right? So in this sense, our work with Insight, so we are the charity partner within this larger consortium, partly funded by the UK government, but also having Moorfields Eye Hospital, University Hospital Birmingham, Google Health, which is DeepMind turned into Google Health, and Roche Genentech. So together, we're trying to make those data sets available in a more ethical way, controlled way, so others can help us understand or analyze this data set. That's one. But also on the AAAMD side, we're interested in preventing the disease from going down to the bad stage. We are trying to work on a new infrastructure where we are trying to get the community data set outside the hospital. So together, those two data sets can really bring the ground, right, or the data that other groups can come up and start to help us unpick or look at things or find things we never imagined we would see.
I mean, I think that's a really interesting example, both of them, both the DeepMind example, but also working with community data. And that raises interesting questions about data ethics and data governance, which Tarek mentioned briefly. But Tina, I'd like to bring you in on this. So, can you maybe give us some advice or some guidance on perhaps the best way to involve patients or the carers or the public in key decisions about health data?
Yes, I mean, I think it's about informed choice. I mean, I think we need to help people understand what the possibilities and also the limitations are. And I think sometimes people assume that information given to one practitioner automatically transfers to somebody else in another part of the health system. And that doesn't always happen. So I think we need to make sure that people understand. What I'd like to see is that the patient being able to hold some of this data themselves, and then they can make sure that it goes to the people that they need it to at the time it needs to. I have a smartphone which does all sorts of really good stuff, but there's a lot of limitations. And I think if we talk to people about how they think they could use it, I'm sure we could smooth out a lot of these issues and make sure that we're delivering more personalised and appropriate and timely care for people.
And do you think there's a role in patients or carers or the public in helping to determine the research questions themselves?
Oh gosh, absolutely. I mean, I think one of our frustrations I've seen from people is, why are we researching this when actually this means more to me? Or indeed, people have said, I've got a really good question I want answered. How can we get that as a research? How can we turn that into a research project? So the NIHR is starting to be more responsive and look at how we can reach out to people, and also how people can come into us with these queries and how we can work with them to make sure that we are looking at things which matter to people on the ground the most. And I myself have been involved in research, and also as somebody who's helped form that question in the first place, which actually is very empowering. It's very inclusive. It means that we're looking at things that perhaps other professionals or researchers might not consider. So it opens up a whole gamut of possibilities.
That's brilliant, thank you. So Indra, I wondered if I could bring you in maybe to speak about the role of AI in health and social care, both maybe the perceived role and then the actual role, perhaps the reality.
Sure. So one of the things that we've done centrally is set up something called an NHS AI lab, and we're all about accelerating the safe adoption of AI into health and care. And you talk about the kind of the perceived and the reality. So a good example would be is we opened up a round 1 of an AI award earlier in the year, back in January, and round 2 is currently open. So those interested, do take a look. We had 500 applications. It was brilliant. Lots of people applied, and of those 42 were selected and 10 were selected for rollout. So actually there is a perception that the market's still quite young. But actually when you look at going back to what types of data do we consider health data, when you look at the kind of wider lens of the applicable data or the available data, You know, we've got some technologies looking at triage. We've got a good company who's looking at particularly relevant now, like when is a patient ready to leave the ITU, the intensive care unit, which is a very sensible thing, because quite often you're looking at large data sets, which if you give it to, and I say this in the nicest possible way, but if you give it to the machine, it's easier for the machine to look at multiple different components than it is sometimes for the human to do that. And then on the flip side, on that kind of clinical aspects, we're seeing a lot of technologies in the image recognition. Lee's talked about eyes. We've also got lungs and brain. A number of companies coming forward in that space as well. So I think there is a broad spectrum. But going back to the point that Tina made, you know, you have to bring people along, and we're doing a lot of work with a number of partners, including sort of Tarek and the Wellcome. We're kind of saying, well, what are the public perceptions with some of these technologies, especially when it's direct care, involvement in direct care. And then the second thing is getting those regulators on board. And as part of the AI lab, we've done a huge amount of work with our national regulators to say, okay, let's think about these technologies from a real world perspective, not from a kind of hypothetical perspective anymore. And what are the implications as we roll those out into the front line? So it's quite a broad spectrum when we're talking about AI.
So I'd be really interested to know, because you gave a few interesting examples there. So are there any common kind of criteria or features that mean that it's easier or more practical to introduce some kind of AI algorithm in a particular context? So are there any areas of kind of health and social care where that's, you know, they're kind of ready to go? And if so, what are the criteria? What are the features that make that possible?
It all comes down to the data. That's the reality of when you talk about large sets of data, the quality of the data, the availability of the data, and then the building of the models on top of that. And those researchers on the call will know that actually getting access, cleaning, and getting your data in a set where you can actually build a model, that's a huge amount of time, and actually then building the model doesn't always take that amount of time. What we found is where the data sets are good. So I've talked a lot about image recognition technology, that kind of triage element where we have these set criteria for next step decisions or next best action. You see a lot of technologies there, and we've seen that in round one of the award. I would say moving forwards, there's still a huge amount to do what we call validating algorithms. So it's great that you've built something, but how do you validate it for our population here in the UK? And then how do you actually implement it into a system so that it's part of the care pathway, but it's not kind of standalone, so you don't go and walk away, have a look and then come back, but it's actually integrated into the care pathway. So that's the work we're doing now. Going back to your question on the set criteria, we do have, I mean, we've got colleagues on the panel who work in research. Some of these are normal set criteria, they're not new. And then we've also added in some from our recently published Guide to Good Practice. We've also published a buyer's guide where there are certain criteria that we ask people to consider around ethics, around proportionality of data and bias of data, to make sure that companies are thinking about these things if they haven't already.
That's brilliant, thank you. And Tarek, we've been talking about this mostly from a UK perspective so far, and I'd be really interested to know, what does this look like internationally?
Yeah, sure. And without kind of giving away the punchline, the short answer is very similar. So a lot of the ideas that Indra, Tina, and Lee have brought up, we recognized in a landscaping study we commissioned of several countries in East Africa last year. So maybe just building on Indra's point, I think we actually saw similar issues around patient consent and concern around ensuring adequate data protection was in place when individual data was being used. And the way we've translated that into our work at Wellcome is, you know, we're interested in funding health data science where we're seeing trustworthy technology being built in trustworthy institutions by trustworthy teams. And that's the way of really putting, let's say, trust and ethics into practice rather than just having them as principles. So that's one idea that is very similar in low and middle income countries. One that's maybe slightly different is the sort of talent question. So there's this, you know, perhaps sometimes lazy assumption that there's no AI or technology talent in a lot of low and middle income countries. I think we found the opposite is true in the countries in East Africa where we did the landscaping. You're seeing folks like IBM now well established in Kenya, not quite East Africa, but you've got Google with a major Africa research hub in Ghana. You've got Microsoft in Nigeria, and what that points to is a increasingly rich ecosystem of super savvy tech folks who are either in these companies now or will be out of these companies in a few years, keen to do stuff. So I think there are bright spots of raw talent out there. What I'd say is it's skewed more commercial than public interest. And that's, I think, where the last finding we have comes in, which is the big thing missing to translate some of this sort of raw technical talent into innovation with health data in the public interest is actually just the availability of health data and opportunities for people to innovate with it. So that's what we're really interested in doing, creating opportunities and incentives for this actually really impressive pool of talent to start innovating with health data in those countries.
But when you talk about the kind of limitations on the availability of data, is that the case even when we take that broader definition of health data, or is it mostly clinical data, for example, that's not as readily available for that kind of analysis?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say as with all things, there